Part 1. The Crying Well of San Antonio. It was the sound that made Clara stop that warm October evening, not the wind, not the creak of the old oak limbs swaying over the cracked sidewalk, not the faint hum of some distant traffic light buzzing itself into insomnia, but a sound like someone crying, deep and low, muffled as if swallowed by stone. She had been walking home from the corner store, a grocery bag dangling from each hand, the sun lowering behind the San Antonio rooftops, painting the neighborhood in long, stretched shadows that made even familiar houses look strange. She knew this block well. It was 2 streets over from her own, lined with single-story homes from the late 50s, yards cluttered with lawn chairs and half-dead bushes. But she had never noticed the well before. It sat half-hidden behind a sagging chain-link fence, a circle of moss-dark stone about 3 feet high, capped with a crooked wooden frame where a rusted pulley still clung stubbornly to its beam. She slowed, the crying, soft, rhythmic, and somehow wet, seeming to rise out of that stone throat. It wasn't the sound of a cat, and it wasn't the sound of a baby. It was human, but faint, like it was being pulled from very far away. And for reasons she couldn't name, Clara stepped toward it, the plastic bags in her hands whispering against her thighs, her breath coming faster. She wasn't the kind of person to believe in neighborhood stories. She'd grown up in San Antonio her whole life and had heard every bit of local nonsense. The Donkey Lady Bridge, the ghost tracks near Shane Road, the white woman of the Olmos Basin, but she'd always chalked it up to bored kids and beer-fueled imaginations. But this didn't feel like some tale whispered in the dark. The air around the well was cooler, and the smell, God, the smell, wasn't just water and mildew, but something metallic and thick, like old coins left in the rain. Her hands tightened around the bags. She told herself she'd look just long enough to see what was making the sound. A trickle of rational thought told her it was probably a prank, some Bluetooth speaker dropped inside by a couple of bored teenagers. But when she leaned over the stone lip and peered into the black, the sound stopped, and for a moment the only thing she heard was her own pulse drumming in her ears. Then the water shimmered into focus far below, and her stomach flipped. She was staring down at her own face. Her own lifeless, pale face, hair fanned out in the water like strands of dark kelp, eyes closed, mouth slightly open as if caught in the middle of a final breath. Clara jerked back so hard she nearly dropped both grocery bags, the plastic stretching under the sudden weight shift. She stumbled, her heel catching on a root pushing through the sidewalk, and for a moment the world tilted, sunlight flaring in her eyes, the whisper of leaves overhead, and then steadied again. She blinked at the well, heart hammering in her chest so loud she could hear it in her ears. The stone circle stood there, perfectly still, perfectly ordinary, as if mocking her with its silence. There was no crying now, no face in the water, just a black, rippling surface that could have been any old rain-filled relic of the past. She took a step back, then another, telling herself she was being ridiculous. Stress, that was all. Long shifts at the diner, the bills piling up, the leak in her bathroom ceiling she kept putting off fixing. Your brain got tired and did strange things. You started seeing shadows where there weren't any. You started hearing things. But as she stood there, the scent of metal still thick in her nostrils, a deeper memory stirred in the back of her mind, something from years ago. She'd been 8 or 9, sitting cross-legged in her grandmother's living room, the old woman's voice low and conspiratorial, telling her about El Pozo que Laura, the Crying Well. The story had been meant as a warning to keep kids from wandering off too far after dark, and even then Clara had rolled her eyes. A murdered child whose sobs rose from the well, luring the curious close enough to look inside, only for them to see their own corpse floating there. The ones who saw it, the story went, never lived more than a week. The well marked them. Clara had laughed it off at the time, but she remembered the way her grandmother's gaze had stayed on her, unblinking, as if to say, "I've seen it happen." And now, standing here with the shadows stretching longer around her, and the last of the sun slipping behind the rooftops, she felt that memory like a cold hand pressing against her back. The grocery bags were getting heavy, the milk sweating through the plastic, the bread shifting with each of her quickening breath. She told herself to turn around, to go home, to forget the whole thing. But she knew even as she stepped backward toward the sidewalk that she wouldn't forget. Not tonight, not tomorrow, maybe not ever. That night, Clara lay in bed with the lights off and the hum of her old window unit filling the room, but sleep didn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that face in the water, her face, pale and bloated, hair drifting in some unseen current. She told herself it was nothing but a trick of the light and her own overactive memory feeding off a childhood ghost story. But the mind isn't a dog you can whistle to heel. It wanders where it wants, sniffing out fears you thought you'd buried. Around midnight, she gave up on trying to sleep and padded into the kitchen, bare feet cold against the linoleum. She poured a glass of water and sat at the small table by the window, looking out into the quiet neighborhood. The street lamps burned with their usual sodium glow, painting the empty road in sickly orange, but her eyes kept drifting to the darker patch where the well stood behind its fence. She couldn't see it from here, not really, but she could feel its presence, as if the old stones radiated some quiet magnetism. And then, so faint she thought at first it was the air conditioner cycling off, she heard it again. A sob. Just one, soft and almost polite, as though whoever made it didn't want to disturb anyone else. She held her breath, listening, and there it was again, rising and falling, the sound curling in through the cracks of her apartment like smoke. Clara set her glass down without realizing she'd done it. She should have called someone, anyone, but she knew how it would sound. Hey, I think there's a crying ghost in the neighborhood well. Even the cops who dealt with the Donkey Lady Bridge calls would hang up on her. The sobbing went on, steady now, and she realized it wasn't random. It had a rhythm, almost like breathing. Almost like the ocean's pull on the shore. She stood, every muscle in her body both tense and wanting to move. Somewhere deep down, a part of her already knew she was going back there, even though another part screamed that she should lock every door and wait for morning. But fear, Clara knew, didn't always keep people away from things. It could also draw them in, the way a moth will fling itself at a flame knowing the heat will destroy it. By the time she reached the end of her street, the night had deepened into that peculiar hour when most of the world is asleep but the air still feels faintly restless, as if the dark itself were breathing. Clara hadn't even bothered to put on shoes. She padded along in her socks, the pavement cool beneath her feet, carrying only a small flashlight she'd fished out of her kitchen drawer. The beam bobbed across the cracked sidewalks and overgrown yards, catching on chain-link fences, rusted lawn ornaments, the glint of some cat's eyes before it bolted under a porch. The sobbing was louder now, though not in the way she'd expected. It didn't rise in volume so much as it thickened, like fog, becoming harder to ignore, harder to move through without feeling it cling to her. She turned the corner onto the block where the well sat, and the air grew colder, just enough to make her skin pebble. The well came into view, squatting behind its sagging fence like some patient animal waiting for her to get close enough. She hesitated at the gate, the latch half rusted, the wood groaning under her hand as she pushed it open. The sound of crying didn't stop this time. It pulsed up from the black throat of the well, steady, measured, as if whoever was down there knew she'd returned and wasn't afraid of being heard. Clara's flashlight beam skimmed over the stone lip, the moss fat and glistening in the pale light, the pulley above swaying just enough to creak. She stepped closer, until her knees brushed the edge, and aimed the light straight down. The beam hit the water far below, and for a moment all she saw was her own reflection, warped and shivering. But then the water rippled without wind or cause, and the reflection began to change. Her eyes drifted shut in the water's image, her skin paling to a waxy gray, lips parting to release a stream of bubbles. She felt her own breath hitch, her lungs straining as if she were holding in a lungful of air underwater. Her heart pounded once, twice, then skipped. Somewhere above her, a distant dog barked, breaking whatever had been happening, and the water stilled. Her reflection was her own again, but Clara was already stumbling back, flashlight beam swinging wildly, the crying still echoing faintly as she fled through the gate and back into the night. She didn't remember getting back to her apartment. One moment she was stumbling away from the well, the flashlight's beam jittering over the cracked sidewalks, the sound of those sobs curling around her ankles like mist. The next, she was inside, door slammed, back pressed hard against it, as if the thin wood could keep out whatever she'd just seen. Her socks were damp. She didn't want to think about why. The flashlight lay on the counter, still on, its beam pointing up at the ceiling in a pale cone. She should have turned it off, locked the door, called someone, but instead she drifted to the bathroom like she was sleepwalking. The light over the sink flickered once when she pulled the chain, casting her face into brief shadow before settling into a steady glow. She stared at herself in the mirror. At first, everything was normal, her own wide brown eyes, the faint sheen of sweat on her forehead, the way her hair had fallen loose from its bun. But then, like a trick of bad glass, the reflection began to lag, its movements just a fraction of a second behind hers. She raised her hand to touch her cheek, and in the mirror, her other hand moved instead. The air in the small room grew heavier, thicker, like breathing through a wet cloth. And then her reflection's lips parted, water trickling out in a slow, steady line, running down her chin, darkening her shirt. Clara staggered back, a choked sound in her throat, eyes locked on the impossible scene as more water poured from the mouth of the thing in the mirror, carrying with it a thin strand of hair, dark like hers, but tangled, matted. The sobbing began again, not from outside, not from the well, but from somewhere impossibly close, as though it were coming from behind the glass. The bulb overhead popped, plunging the room into darkness, and in that instant she felt, knew, that there was something standing right behind her, close enough for its breath to chill the skin at the nape of her neck. She didn't turn around. Some animal part of her brain knew that turning around would make it real in a way that would leave no coming back. Instead, she bolted forward, out of the bathroom, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. The crying didn't stop. It followed, muffled through the wood, in that same slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat. She backed into the living room, tripping over the edge of the rug and landing hard on her hip, breath ragged. From the bathroom came a wet sound, like someone dragging a soaked blanket across tile. The doorknob rattled once, twice, then stilled. Clara's mind raced, her thoughts tripping over each other in a frantic loop. This isn't happening. I didn't see it. It's a dream. It's stress. But beneath all that noise was the cold, rational knowledge that the thing she'd seen in the mirror wasn't a dream, and it wasn't stress. It was connected to the well, the same way her grandmother's story had been. Her grandmother had said the well marked you, but she'd never said how fast it started, how soon it came for you. Clara crawled toward the couch, half thinking she could hide behind it like a child, when something wet and cold slid against her bare ankle. She froze, heart slamming so hard it hurt, and slowly looked down. A thin trail of water snaked along the floor from the bathroom, curling toward her like a living thing. In the reflection on its surface, just for an instant, she saw her own dead eyes staring back at her again. And then, from somewhere deep inside the apartment where no one should have been, a voice whispered, not sobbing now, but clear, precise, and impossibly close. I'm you. Clara scrambled backward until her spine hit the wall, the cold seeping through her thin t-shirt. The trail of water thickened, spreading across the hardwood, and with it came that metallic smell again, like old pennies and rusted nails steeped in rainwater. The whisper echoed in her skull, too intimate, too knowing, as if the voice was speaking from inside her rather than into her ears. Her breathing turned ragged, but some stubborn corner of her mind, maybe the last sane part, forced her to get to her feet. She stumbled toward the door, fumbling with the deadbolt, her hands slick with sweat. The lock stuck, the metal grinding against metal, refusing to turn. Behind her, the sound of water dripping grew louder, heavier, each splash hitting the floor with a deliberate slowness. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The apartment was dark except for the faint cone of light from the still-running flashlight on the counter, and in that light she saw footprints, bare, wet footprints, appearing one by one on the floor, each angled toward her. They weren't hers. They were too small, child-sized, and they were getting closer. Something in her chest snapped then. Fear, reason, maybe both, and with a violent twist she wrenched the deadbolt open, flung the door wide, and ran barefoot into the night. She didn't stop to close it. She didn't remember how far she ran. 2 blocks, maybe 3, before her legs gave out and she collapsed onto the curb, chest heaving, the damp from the pavement seeping into her sock. The night was too quiet here, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, like the whole world was holding its breath. For a moment she thought she'd outrun it. Her pulse began to slow, and the tightness in her throat eased just enough for her to gulp air without choking. Then she heard it, faint, almost lost under the hum of a distant street lamp, the sobbing. Not behind her anymore. Ahead. She looked up, and her stomach dropped. At the far end of the street, barely lit by the orange glow, stood the well. The same sagging fence, the same moss-black stones. It should have been back in the other neighborhood, blocks away, but it was here, impossibly here, waiting. And leaning against its edge, facing her, was a small, waterlogged shape. It was no taller than a child of 6 or 7, hair plastered to its skull, skin the color of wet clay. She couldn't make out its features, but she didn't need to, because she recognized the shirt it wore. Her shirt. The one she had on right now, down to the faint bleach stain near the hem. The figure tilted its head, the motion too slow, too deliberate, and from the black hole of the well behind it came a voice, her voice, speaking in perfect unison with her own thoughts. Come closer. For a long, awful moment Clara didn't move. The street between her and the well felt stretched, like a strip of chewing gum pulled until it's about to snap, every detail sharpened in that strange, silent tension. The figure by the well stood perfectly still, head cocked at the same inhuman angle, its hair hanging in wet clumps that glistened in the dim light. Somewhere far off, a car door slammed and an engine turned over, but the sound didn't belong to this place. It felt like it came from another world entirely, one she wasn't part of anymore. The air was thick with that cold metallic tang, and the longer she stared, the more she realized the figure wasn't just wearing her shirt, it was wearing everything she had on. The gray pajama pants, the frayed elastic at the ankle, even the single dark thread sticking from the hem that she'd been meaning to cut. It wasn't a copy. It was hers. The thing's arms hung stiffly at its sides, but its fingers twitched now and then, little spasms that made her skin crawl. She thought of running, but some instinct deeper than fear told her that turning her back would be worse. Much worse. What do you want? She tried to say, but the words came out as a whisper she barely recognized as her own. The figure's lips didn't move, but the answer still came, riding the air in a voice that was both hers and not hers. You already know. And maybe she did, though she couldn't have explained it even to herself. The well's dark mouth yawned behind the thing, the faint echo of sobbing curling out like steam, and Clara understood in some awful, wordless way that the distance between her and that stone circle wasn't real. If she took a single step forward, she wouldn't just be closer, she'd be there. And if she went there, she wouldn't come back. Clara's legs trembled, the muscles in her calves fluttering as though she'd been running for miles instead of standing frozen in the dark. The air between her and the figure shimmered faintly, like heat rising off asphalt in the middle of summer, but it was cold, so cold her breath curled in front of her in small, frantic clouds. She took a step back, just one, and the figure's head straightened, moving far too slowly, as though it were savoring the motion. Its eyes, God, its eyes, caught the weak glow of the street lamp and glistened, but there was no reflection there, no glint of life. They were flat and heavy, the kind of eyes you saw on a fish hauled up from deep water. Clara's hands clenched at her sides. She thought of bolting into one of the nearby yards, pounding on a stranger's door until they let her in, but some quiet dread told her that no matter where she ran, she'd find the well waiting there. She could almost feel it in the pit of her stomach, like the pull of a tide she couldn't fight. And then the figure moved, not toward her, but toward the well. Each small footstep left a wet print on the pavement, and when it reached the moss-dark stones, it placed its small, stiff hands on the lip and leaned forward. Clara didn't want to watch, but she couldn't look away as the figure bent further and further until it tipped into the blackness. There was no splash, just silence, and then a single sob, deep and hollow, that seemed to come from the space directly behind Clara's head. She spun, the movement jerky, desperate, but the street behind her was empty. Still, she could feel it, something standing too close, breathing too slow. She turned back toward the well, half expecting the street to be empty again, but it wasn't. The stones seemed taller now, the wooden frame looming overhead like a gallows, and the shadows it cast rippled as though stirred by unseen water. The sobbing had changed, slower, more deliberate, each sound spaced just far enough apart to set her teeth on edge. Clara took a step backward, her heels scraping against the curb, and in that tiny noise, the sobbing stopped. The stillness that followed was worse than the sound itself. Then, from the well's darkness, two pale hands emerged, small and dripping, gripping the mossy stones. The child, her double, her drowned self, pulled upward, inch by inch, until its head broke the surface of the lip. This close, under the jaundiced light of the street lamp, she could see that the skin wasn't just pale. It was bloated, water-swollen, the veins faint blue lines beneath the surface. The hair hung in dripping clumps, strands clinging to the slack face, and when the eyes lifted to meet hers, the corners of its mouth twitched upward in a smile that wasn't hers. "You're late," it said, the words wet and burbling, as if spoken through a mouthful of water. Clara's throat closed. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but the weight of that gaze pinned her in place. The thing climbed further, one leg hooking over the stones, water streaming from its clothes to pool darkly on the pavement. Somewhere far away, a dog began to howl, and the sound seemed to push the air colder still, as though the night itself were recoiling from what was stepping out of the well. Clara stumbled backward until her calf hit the edge of the curb, nearly sending her sprawling. The thing's bare foot touched the pavement with a soft slap, and for the briefest second, the wet footprint it left steamed in the cold air. Up close, the smell was unbearable, a mix of stagnant pond water and something sweet and rotten beneath it, like fruit left too long in the sun. The figure's head tilted again, just enough for the water in its hair to drip steadily onto the street, each drop sounding louder than it should have, like the tick of a clock in a silent room. "It's time," it murmured, and the voice wasn't only in Clara's ears, it was inside her skull, vibrating in her teeth, sliding behind her eyes. Her legs moved before she told them to, carrying her one step forward, then another, as if an invisible string were pulling her toward the well. She fought to stop, digging her heels into the pavement, but every muscle resisted her own commands. The figure began to back away, inching toward the well's open mouth, never breaking eye contact, its lips curling in a parody of reassurance. Clara realized with a cold jolt of terror that it wasn't retreating, it was leading her in. Somewhere in the back of her mind, her grandmother's voice whispered, soft and certain, "The well doesn't take you. It makes you walk in yourself." Her breath came in shallow bursts, each one a battle against the invisible pressure closing in on her chest. Every step toward the well felt heavier than the last, like wading through waist-deep water, though the street beneath her feet was dry. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but underneath it she could hear something else. A faint splash, then another, slow and steady, as though something large was moving in the water below, waiting. The figure stopped just short of the stone lip and stood aside, gesturing toward the darkness with one pale, waterlogged hand. Clara's body leaned forward, her toes curling over the curb now, and she realized with a gut-deep dread that if she didn't fight, really fight, she'd be looking into that well in seconds. She dug her nails into her palms until she felt the skin break, the sharp sting grounding her enough to jerk one step backward. The voice in her head grew louder, no longer a whisper but a demand, layered with a sound like rushing water. "Don't fight. You're already mine." Her vision blurred at the edges, black spots swelling inward, and the cold was so intense now her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Somewhere to her left, a streetlight popped and went dark, plunging half the block into shadow. The figure's head snapped toward the sudden darkness, and in that momentary shift of attention, Clara seized control of her legs and bolted, not away from the well, but across the street, into the maze of backyards and fences beyond, her only thought to put anything, everything, between herself and the pull of that stone throat. The first fence she hit was chain link, rust flaking under her hands, the metal biting into her palms as she scrambled over. She landed hard in the damp grass of someone's backyard, the smell of cut weeds sharp in her nose. A dog barked from somewhere inside the house, but it was a nervous, muffled sound, not the furious alarm she might have expected. Clara didn't slow down. She cut across the yard, vaulted a low hedge, and found herself in another lawn, this one cluttered with plastic toys glistening under the streetlight spill. Somewhere behind her, a faint wet patter began again, footsteps, too light to belong to anything grown, but steady, unhurried. She risked a glance over her shoulder and froze. The figure was there, halfway across the first yard, moving with a strange, jerking gait, like it didn't quite understand how joints worked. Each time its foot touched the grass, a dark stain spread outward, as if water was soaking up from beneath the earth. Clara spun and ran harder, lungs burning, the fences and hedges blurring past. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed distance. But no matter how many yards she crossed, how many fences she scaled, the sound followed, padding along in that same perfect rhythm, neither gaining nor falling behind. And then she realized the worst thing of all. The crying had started again, but now it was coming from ahead of her. She skidded to a halt, sneakers tearing wet grooves into the grass, because the sound wasn't just ahead, it was everywhere. The crying rolled over her in waves, bouncing off the quiet houses and narrow fences, warping in pitch like a radio dial being twisted back and forth. A thin mist had begun to seep in low along the ground, swirling around her ankles, and in its gray veil she saw shapes. Small, hunched, shivering shapes, scuttling just beyond the reach of her vision. She took a step back, her heel knocking against something solid. When she turned, her stomach plunged. The well was there, in the middle of the yard where a swing set had been only seconds ago, the same cracked stone and black opening yawning at her feet. She knew, this wasn't possible. She'd run blocks away, but the air smelled of the same stagnant cold, and somewhere deep below, something splashed. The figure emerged from the mist opposite her, closer than it had ever been, water streaming steadily from its fingertips to the grass. Its mouth moved, shaping words she didn't hear but felt, the meaning slotting into her mind like a jagged puzzle piece. You never left. Behind her, the shapes in the mist began to crawl closer, their tiny hands dragging through the wet grass with soft, sucking sounds. Clara's knees locked, her breath frosting in the air between her and the thing, and she realized she had only one choice left, to look into the well or be pulled in blind. Her legs moved without her consent, as if invisible strings had been hooked deep into her muscles. Step by step, she edged toward the stone rim, the sound of the crying swelling until it was no longer just in her ears but inside her skull, vibrating in her teeth, rattling her bones. The mist coiled upward now, clinging to her shins, her knees, as though trying to help her along. She wanted to scream, but her throat was clenched tight, the air in her lungs solid and useless. When she reached the edge, the figure was suddenly beside her, close enough that she could smell the rot of stagnant water dripping from its clothes. Slowly, it leaned forward, peering into the black circle below, then turned its pale, bloated face toward her as if inviting her to do the same. Clara's body bent forward, and the darkness seemed to rise to meet her. What she saw in that water didn't make sense, not at first. Her own reflection floated there, yes, but the skin was pallid, the lips blue, the eyes wide and glassy. Hair streamed around her head as though she were already submerged. And then that other version of her, dead, still, perfect in its lifelessness, smiled. Something cold and hard clamped around her ankle and yanked. The last thing she heard before the world tilted was the splash, impossibly loud, echoing in her skull like the closing of a vault. The cold hit her like a brick to the chest, so dense, so absolute, it was as if the water itself was made of stone. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't even think. Her body just hung there, suspended in blackness, while her mind screamed at her to swim, kick, do something. But there was no up or down. No bubbles rose from her mouth. Her lungs burned, but when she gasped, no water rushed in, only silence. Then, shapes began to form in the gloom walls, narrow and slick with moss, a tunnel stretching out in front of her like the throat of some gigantic beast. The crying was still there, but muted now, as if it were coming from miles away. Something brushed against her foot. She jerked back and saw a pale arm drifting in the currentless dark, fingers curling slowly toward her. It wasn't attached to anything. The fingers flexed once, twice, then pointed down, toward the depth. Clara realized with sudden, icy certainty that whatever was pulling her hadn't stopped yet. She was still sinking deeper and deeper into a place no sunlight or hope could reach. She tried to kick, but her legs felt like they were moving through wet cement. The darkness wasn't just around her anymore, it was in her. It pressed against her skin, seeped into her ears, crawled behind her eyes. She couldn't tell if her eyelids were open or shut, because there was no difference in the black. Something brushed her shoulder. Then again, but firmer, like a hand trying to turn her around. Clara fought the instinct, twisting away, but the pressure on her shoulder grew stronger until she spun slowly in the water. They were there, a dozen faces, pale as drowned porcelain dolls, hung in the black just a few feet away. Their eyes bulged, lips cracked into jagged grins that didn't match the hollow sorrow bleeding from them. The crying she'd been hearing was theirs, but it wasn't coming from their mouths. It poured from somewhere inside her head, echoing like it was being screamed into the marrow of her bones. One by one, they opened their mouths wide, wider, until their jaws unhinged in ways no human bone could bend. From that darkness within their mouths, small streams of water began to pour, each stream shimmering faintly as it wound through the liquid around them. The streams slithered toward her like living threads. Clara thrashed, but the threads coiled around her wrists, her ankles, her throat. The water coming from their mouths was colder than the surrounding darkness, burning where it touched her skin. It pulled, not violently, but with an implacable, steady insistence, downward, always downward. Her feet touched something. For a heartbeat, hope flared. The bottom. She could push off, maybe swim back up. But when her toes curled, they sank into it. Not solid ground, but something soft, something that yielded under her weight and clung like mud. She looked down. It wasn't mud. It was hair. Dozens, no, hundreds, of pale, bloated heads lay beneath her feet, their hair swirling upward to wrap around her toes and ankles. Some had their eyes open, staring blindly. Others' mouths gaped, spilling bubbles of that same freezing water. As she struggled, the hair wound tighter, dragging her down into the mass. Her scream was swallowed before it could even leave her throat. Above, the ring of faces watched her sink, their unhinged mouths snapping shut in eerie unison. The crying stopped, the pulse came again, and this time Clara felt it in her teeth. A deep, resonant thud that seemed to travel through the water, through the bones of her skull, into her very thoughts. It was too slow to be human, one beat every few seconds, like the massive heart of something that had been sleeping for centuries. And with each pulse, the heads beneath her shifted, just slightly, like they were breathing. The hair around her ankles tightened. She pulled, but every movement only seemed to wind it tighter. Her lungs should have been screaming by now, her chest burning for air, but there was no pain. That terrified her more than drowning ever could. Something was keeping her here, holding her in this black suspension between life and death, breath and suffocation. It was feeding her. On purpose. A ripple passed through the water, and the faces above parted, making a path. Through that dark corridor, something rose. At first, she thought it was part of the well's stone wall breaking loose, a shadow bigger than anything she'd seen down here. But as it came closer, she saw its outline wasn't solid. It was made of water itself, shifting and writhing in slow coils. Within it, shapes swam. Faces, arms, the curve of a ribcage, all moving, all trapped, as if the creature was built entirely from the dead it had claimed. It stopped just short of her, towering in the gloom, and then it leaned close. Two hollows appeared where eyes should be, and from those hollows came the sound of crying, not a child this time, but hundreds of voices at once. The pull became irresistible. Clara's hands clawed at the water, at the empty black space where the surface should be, but it was like trying to swim through tar. The hair coiled tighter, winding up her calves, her thighs, dragging her deeper until the last faint shimmer of light above vanished entirely. All that remained was the rhythm. Thud, pause, and with each beat she could feel her own heart giving in, sinking with the thing that lived here. The heads around her no longer floated aimlessly, they turned toward her, all at once, their eyes glassy but somehow aware. Their mouths opened again, but instead of water, a thick, black vapor bled out and curled toward her face. It smelled like rotting leaves and wet stone, like a cellar sealed for 100 years. When it touched her lips, it slid inside. Her lungs filled, not with air, but with that choking mist. It didn't suffocate her. It changed her. The darkness shifted ahead, parting like curtains, revealing something vast and glistening. At first, she thought it was stone, a wall, perhaps, but as she drew closer, she saw it move. It wasn't stone. It was flesh. Dark, glistening flesh, ridged and scarred like something ancient had been sleeping in this well since before San Antonio was even a name. And there, in the center of it, was the heart. It was the size of a car, pulsing slowly, each contraction rippling through the walls of the well itself. Veins the size of her arms ran out from it in all directions, disappearing into the black. Every time it beat, she could hear faint splashes above, like the sound of something new falling into the water. The tendril returned, wrapping around her chest, pulling her closer. She didn't fight this time. She couldn't. Her body wasn't hers anymore. She reached out, and touched the surface of the heart. The moment her fingers brushed it, her mind was flooded with a voice, not in words but in memories and feelings. Hunger. Loneliness. Centuries of it. And beneath all of that, a promise: stay. You will never be alone again. She saw her own reflection in the slick surface of the heart, but it wasn't hers anymore. The eyes were wrong. The smile wasn't hers either. And behind her reflection, she saw the faces of every soul the well had ever taken, all staring out at her, waiting. The pull became a plunge, and the heart opened, literally opened, like a mouth. She was drawn inside, swallowed whole, and for a brief, final second, she thought she heard the sound of children laughing above the well. Then the black closed in forever. 3 days later, nobody in the neighborhood remembered Clara Rodriguez. Not really. They remembered the way her house looked, the overgrown lawn, the paint peeling off in strips that fluttered in the wind like loose skin. They remembered her mother, quiet, polite, always in a hurry. But Clara herself? She was like a name on the tip of the tongue, a shadow at the edge of vision. If you pressed them, they could maybe describe a girl with long black hair and tired eyes. Or maybe that was someone else. The memory slid away too easily, like water over stone. But the well remembered. The crying started again the night after the Rodriguez family's sudden decision to move out. Folks chalked it up to the wind, or to some old plumbing pipes groaning under the summer heat. Still, some people swore they heard the sound of a little girl sobbing under the manhole covers, or echoing faintly from storm drains. Others claimed the sound came from the well itself, the old stone one behind the rusted gate at the corner of Camilla Street. That's where Jeremy Phelps first heard it. Jeremy was 13, lanky, with a permanent scowl carved into his face. His dad worked late shifts at the refinery, his mom was more interested in her vodka than in him, and Jeremy had gotten good at being invisible. Summer boredom had driven him into the streets that night, aimlessly pedaling his bike past rows of houses where the lights were already out. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he had the kind of restless energy that always seemed to find it. That he'd heard the stories about the well, every kid in that part of San Antonio had. The crying ghost thing was practically playground currency. But he'd never believed it. Ghost stories were just something adults made up to keep you from wandering where you shouldn't. He was about to pedal past when the sound froze him. It was faint, almost too soft to notice at first, but the longer he listened, the more it pressed into him. The sound of a child sobbing, thin and hollow, drifting up from somewhere impossibly deep. Jeremy dropped his bike and walked to the gate. The padlock was still there, rusted nearly through, but someone had pulled the chain loose enough to squeeze inside. The well was smaller than he'd imagined, the stone dark and slick with moss. The wooden cover had been gone for years, replaced by nothing but a yawning circle of blackness. Jeremy jerked back from the edge so fast his heel caught on the uneven stone, and he nearly went over backward. For a second, his brain scrambled for explanations. Echo? Some weird acoustic thing? He wasn't even sure he'd heard it out loud. It felt like it had been whispered straight into the space behind his ears. The well stayed silent. The air around it felt heavier now, though, like standing too close to a running engine. Jeremy licked his lips, found them dry, and stepped forward again. He told himself it was just curiosity. The kind that made people poke at dead birds with sticks or check under their beds, even when they knew nothing was there. He leaned over, squinting into the dark. Nothing. No gleam of water, no bottom at all, just black that seemed thicker than the night around it. And then, movement. It was quick, almost too quick to catch, but something pale shifted far down in the dark. A ripple like a fish turning in slow water. Jeremy's breath caught. His hands gripped the stone rim. Come see, the voice whispered again. It wasn't his voice this time. It was a girl's. High, wet, trembling. He should have run. Every nerve in his body told him to. But there was something in the tone, something that sounded so scared, so desperate, that made him freeze. He thought of the way his little sister used to call him when she had nightmares, before the divorce, before she stopped talking to him altogether. Jeremy didn't remember making the choice to climb onto the rim. But there he was, balanced, peering down as the black seemed to reach up for him. A cold, damp wind rose from the well's mouth, smelling of stone and rot and something sweet underneath, like overripe fruit. It wrapped around him, tugging at his clothes. And in it, beneath the smell, was the faintest whiff of shampoo, strawberry. He leaned forward. That was when the hands shot up. They were small, impossibly small, and bone-white in the moonlight. Fingers like sticks, skin puckered and bloated, nails black and splintered. They clamped around his wrists with the strength of a vice, and yanked. Jeremy's scream didn't even make it past his teeth before the world flipped upside down. The stars swung wildly. The rim of the well flashed past, and then there was nothing but cold and dark swallowing him whole. Instead, he plunged into something thick and icy, more like syrup than liquid, that clung to his skin and dragged at his clothes. It stole the heat from his body instantly, crawling into his lungs when he gasped. The darkness wasn't just around him, it was inside him, pushing against his skull, seeping into the edges of his thoughts. Somewhere above, impossibly far away, he thought he heard his bike fall over on the sidewalk. The sound was dull and small, like it belonged to another world. The girl's sobbing echoed from every direction now, not from below but from within the walls, as if the stone itself was crying. Jeremy tried to kick upward, but there was no up anymore, no sense of which way was which. His wrists still burned where the small white hands had grabbed him, though he couldn't see them now. He twisted in the black, and for the first time he saw other shapes drifting nearby. Bodies. Some were small, some adult-sized, their faces pale and soft as melted wax. Their eyes were open, staring, but their mouths moved, working silently like fish under glass. They turned toward him in slow unison, their gazes locking on him as though they'd been waiting. One of them, tall, hair floating around her head like dark seaweed, opened her mouth wide enough that her jaw seemed to unhinge. From it came the same voice he'd heard above, "Come see." The cold thickened, squeezing around him like a fist. His chest ached. His thoughts started to dim. The last thing Jeremy saw, before the black swallowed everything, was his own face drifting toward him through the dark. Eyes open, lips blue, hair waving gently in the unseen current. It smiled, and then it took his place.